The first gunshot of the evening tore through the saloon's stale air, just as Violet Nichols poured another round for the town's most notorious drunkard. The year was 1878, and Dry Creek, Colorado, was a dusty stain on the map where dreams came to die and reputations rarely survived intact. Violet's certainly hadn't. "Another whiskey, misused up," the man slurred, sliding a grimy coin across the bar top. The nickname stung no less today than it had 3 years ago when she'd first arrived in town, broken and desperate after fleeing a marriage that had been more prison than partnership. Violet wiped her hands on her apron, ignoring the barb with practiced indifference. At 24, the softness of youth had already begun to leave her face, replaced by a hardened resolve that kept her moving forward despite the whispers that followed her everywhere in this godforsaken place. "That'll be your last for tonight, Mr. Dawson," she replied evenly, pouring a measure significantly smaller than he'd paid for. She'd learned the hard way that drunken men were dangerous men. The saloon doors swung open, bringing with them a gust of desert air and the silhouette of a man Violet had never seen before. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a gait that spoke of confidence rather than arrogance. The stranger wore trailed dust like a second skin and carried himself with the quiet alertness of someone accustomed to watching his back. "Water, please," he said, approaching the bar. His voice was deep but soft, the kind that didn't need volume to command attention. "And information, if you're selling that too." Violet studied him as she filled a glass. Unlike most who passed through Dry Creek, he looked at her face rather than letting his gaze wander. His eyes were startlingly blue against his sun-darkened skin, and he removed his hat as he addressed her, a courtesy she'd nearly forgotten existed. "Information costs more than water," she replied, sliding the glass toward him. "What kind are you looking for?" "A man named Harrington. Thomas Harrington. Word is he's running a ranch outside of town." Violet felt her blood run cold. "Harrington's spread is 10 miles west. Follow the creek until you hit a split-rail fence with the letter H burned into the posts." The stranger noticed her change in demeanor. "You know him?" "Everyone knows everyone in Dry Creek," she answered noncommittally. "Name's Caleb Quinn," he said, extending a hand that bore calluses from rope and reins. "Just hired on as Harrington's new foreman." Violet didn't take his hand. "Then you'll be leaving soon, I expect." "No point in making acquaintances." Caleb withdrew his hand, but maintained his steady gaze. "I've found there's always a point in knowing people's names, especially those who speak truth when they serve water." "Violet," she conceded reluctantly. "Violet Nichols." "Well, Miss Nichols, I appreciate the directions." He placed a coin on the counter that was worth far more than the water. "Keep the change." She should have left it there, should have let him walk away with his polite nod and his too generous tip. But something, perhaps the fact that he'd spoken to her like a person rather than damaged goods, made her reach for his arm. "Mr. Quinn," she said quietly, "Harrington is not a good man." Caleb's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes hardened. "I've worked for bad men before, Miss Nichols. I know how to handle them. Not like him." The words felt dangerous on her tongue. Caleb leaned slightly closer. "Is there something I should know?" Before she could answer, a crash from across the room demanded her attention. One of the card players had upended a table, accusing another of cheating. Within seconds, fists were flying. "Excuse me," Violet said, reaching beneath the bar for the shotgun kept there. She didn't need to fire it, just the sound of it being cocked was usually enough to restore order. By the time the dispute was settled and the troublemakers tossed out, Caleb Quinn was gone, leaving Violet with an unsettled feeling and words of warning still trapped behind her teeth. The next morning dawned with the merciless brilliance typical of Colorado summers. Violet rose early as always, washing in the small basin in her room above the saloon. The meager accommodations were part of her arrangement with Frank, the saloon's owner, a fair man who paid her decently and, more importantly, never tried to pressure her into providing services beyond tending bar. She studied her reflection in the cracked mirror. Dark circles shadowed eyes that had seen too much for their years. Her copper hair, once her pride, was pulled back severely from a face that rarely smiled anymore. Thomas Harrington had taken that from her, along with so much else. 3 years ago, she'd arrived in Dry Creek as Thomas's new bride, having married him in Denver after a whirlwind courtship that had swept her off her feet. He'd promised her the world. What he delivered was a remote ranch where his true nature emerged, controlling, cruel, and violent. It had taken 8 months of escalating abuse before she'd found the courage to flee one night while he was away on business. She'd made it to town with nothing but the clothes on her back and a few coins sewn into her hem. The good women of Dry Creek had wanted nothing to do with a runaway wife. The church doors had closed to her. Only Frank had offered her work, and even that hadn't spared her from becoming the subject of malicious gossip. Harrington had made sure of that, spreading stories about her supposed infidelities and moral failings to explain away her departure. Used goods, they called her behind her back. Unwanted woman, they whispered when she passed. And though she'd built a life for herself despite it all, the stigma clung to her like a shadow. As she made her way downstairs to begin her morning chores, Violet pushed thoughts of Caleb Quinn from her mind. Men like him, decent-seeming men, were dangerous in their own way. They made you hope, and hope was a luxury she could no longer afford. 2 weeks passed before Violet saw Caleb again. The saloon was quieter than usual for a Saturday night when he walked in, looking more settled in his role as foreman. The trail dust had been replaced by the clean scent of soap, though his clothes still bore the honest signs of a day's hard work. "Miss Nichols," he greeted her with a tip of his hat. "I'll take whatever you're serving for supper." Violet nodded, turning to the small kitchen to dish up the simple stew she'd prepared earlier. When she returned with the bowl and a chunk of bread, she found him seated at the bar rather than at one of the empty tables. "How are you finding work at Harrington's?" she asked, unable to curb her curiosity. "Hard but fair so far," Caleb replied, breaking the bread. "He's got ambitions to expand, which means plenty of work for the crew. Though I've noticed he's not particularly well liked in town." Violet wiped down the bar, keeping her hands busy. "People respect his money more than the man." "And what about his wife?" "There's a room kept for her, but Harrington says she's been visiting family back east for some time now." Violet's hand stilled for just a moment before resuming its motion. "Is that what he says?" Caleb's gaze sharpened. "That's what he says." "Then I suppose that's the truth of it," she replied carefully. Caleb took a bite of stew, watching her over the spoon. "You know, it's the strangest thing. When I was getting settled in the foreman's quarters, I found a small lady's handkerchief tucked behind a loose board. Had the initials VH embroidered on it." Violet Harrington, perhaps? The color drained from Violet's face. "You shouldn't have come back here, Mr. Quinn. Asking questions like that could be dangerous for both of us." "I'm not afraid of Harrington," Caleb said quietly. "Then you're a fool." Violet glanced around to ensure no one was listening. "And I've had my fill of foolish men. I've been called worse," he acknowledged with a half-smile that softened the hard lines of his face. "But I'm also patient and observant, like how I've observed that you flinch whenever someone comes through that door too quickly. Or how you positioned yourself so you can see every entrance and exit in this room. Tending bar teaches you to be cautious, as does running from something or someone who hurt you badly." Violet felt exposed, as if he'd peeled away the protective layers she'd so carefully constructed. "What do you want, Mr. Quinn?" "The truth, for starters. And then, perhaps, a chance to help." "Why would you want to help me? You don't even know me." Caleb's expression turned serious. "Because I've seen enough of this world to recognize when someone's been wronged. And because everyone deserves better than to be labeled used or unwanted by people who don't know the first thing about survival." For the first time in years, Violet felt something crack in the wall she'd built around herself. It was a dangerous feeling. "You can't help me. No one can. Harrington would never grant me a divorce, and even if he did, where would I go? What respectable household would employ a woman with my reputation?" "There are other places than Dry Creek," Caleb pointed out. "Other lives to be lived." "Says the man who can saddle up and ride whenever the mood strikes him," Violet retorted. "Women don't have that freedom." "Maybe not alone," Caleb agreed, "but with the right ally." The saloon doors banged open, cutting off his words. A group of cowboys from a neighboring ranch burst in, already half-drunk and looking for more entertainment than liquor. Violet straightened, her professional mask slipping back into place. "I need to work," she said, "and you need to be careful about the questions you ask." Caleb finished his meal in thoughtful silence, leaving another generous payment behind when he departed. Only after he was gone did Violet notice the folded paper beneath his plate. "Meet me at dawn by the old cottonwood near the creek," it read. I have information you need to hear. Violet crumpled the note and tossed it into the fire. She had no intention of meeting Caleb Quinn or anyone else in secret. Such recklessness had cost her dearly before. Yet as the night wore on and the saloon finally emptied, she found herself unable to banish the thought of what information he might possess and why he seemed so determined to help a woman most considered beyond salvation. Dawn found Violet pacing her small room, torn between caution and a curiosity she couldn't suppress. The sensible choice was to stay put, to continue the careful existence she'd carved out for herself. But after 3 years of living in fear, something in Caleb's straightforward manner had awakened a dormant courage. Before she could reconsider, she threw a shawl around her shoulders and slipped out into the pre-dawn light. The old cottonwood stood as it always had, its massive trunk a landmark for travelers. Caleb was already there, his horse tethered nearby, his hat pulled low against the morning chill. "You came," he said, relief evident in his voice. "I wasn't sure you would." "Neither was I," Violet admitted. "What's so important it couldn't be said in the saloon?" "Harrington's in trouble," Caleb replied without preamble. "He's been rustling cattle from neighboring ranches and reselling them across the territory. He's made enemies with some dangerous men." Violet felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "How do you know this?" "Because I'm not just a cowboy looking for work," Caleb said. "I was hired by the Cattlemen's Association to gather evidence against him. They've been tracking stolen cattle for months, and all signs point to Harrington's operation." "You're some kind of lawman?" Violet took an instinctive step back. "Not officially, more of an investigator." "But I need your help, Violet. I need to know what kind of man I'm really dealing with." The use of her first name shouldn't have affected her, but it did a small intimacy in a conversation fraught with danger. "Why would you tell me this? How do you know I won't go straight to Harrington?" "Because I've seen how you look when his name is mentioned," Caleb answered simply. "That's not the look of a woman visiting family back east. That's the look of someone who's escaped something terrible." Violet's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. "What do you want to know?" "Everything you're willing to tell me. Who he is, what he's capable of, and most importantly, whether you're still legally his wife." The question hit her like a physical blow. "Yes," she whispered. "We were married in Denver. I have no means or grounds for divorce. Abuse isn't grounds enough in these parts. Not without proof. And even then, a woman's word against her husband's." She shook her head. "The law favors men like Thomas." "Not all laws," Caleb said. "And certainly not all men." A twig snapped in the distance, and both of them tensed. When nothing followed, Violet exhaled shakily. "We shouldn't be seen together. If Thomas found out." "Come with me," Caleb said suddenly. "Not now, but soon. When this investigation is complete. I can help you get to Denver, maybe further east if that's what you want. Somewhere you can start over without his shadow hanging over you." "Why would you do that for me?" "Because no one deserves to live in fear," Caleb replied. "And because from the moment I walked into that saloon, I knew you were more than what this town calls you." The sincerity in his voice made her chest ache with a long-forgotten feeling hope. Dangerous, treacherous hope. "I can't leave Dry Creek. Thomas would find me. Not if he's behind bars for cattle rustling." The possibility was too enormous to contemplate. Freedom, real freedom, had seemed so far beyond reach that she'd stopped allowing herself to even imagine it. "How close are you to proving his guilt?" "Close," Caleb said. "But I need more time. Another week, maybe 2. Can you wait that long?" Violet had waited 3 years. Another fortnight seemed insignificant by comparison. "Yes. But we can't be seen like this again. It's too risky." Caleb nodded, respecting her caution. "I'll send word when it's time." He hesitated, then added, "Be careful, Violet. If Harrington suspects anything." "I've been careful for a long time," she assured him. "It's how I've survived." As she turned to leave, Caleb caught her hand. The contact sent an unexpected warmth through her, despite the coolness of the morning. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I don't see used or unwanted when I look at you. I see someone brave enough to remake her life against impossible odds." Violet withdrew her hand, but the feeling of his touch lingered. "Save your pretty words, Mr. Quinn. I stopped believing in them a long time ago. Then I'll have to let actions speak instead." He replied with a smile that reached his eyes, the kind of smile that made promises without words. Violet returned to town with her thoughts in turmoil. Hope was dangerous. Trust, even more so. Yet for the first time in 3 years, she allowed herself to imagine a life beyond Dry Creek, a life where she wasn't defined by her past or by the cruel labels a small town had assigned her. It was a dangerous dream, but perhaps, with Caleb Quinn's help, it wasn't an impossible one. The following days crept by with excruciating slowness. Violet maintained her routine at the saloon, serving drinks and deflecting unwanted advances with the practiced ease of one who'd done so countless times before. She caught occasional glimpses of Caleb in town purchasing supplies, conversing with the sheriff, once even sharing a drink with the banker who handled most of the region's cattle sales. Each time, he acknowledged her with nothing more than a polite nod, maintaining the careful distance they'd agreed upon. But on the rare occasions when their eyes met directly, Violet felt the weight of unspoken words between them, a shared secret, a tentative alliance that was beginning to feel like something more. 10 days after their meeting by the cottonwood, disaster struck. Violet was closing up the saloon when Frank called her into his office, his expression grave. "Got some bad news, Violet," he said without preamble. "Thomas Harrington was in town today. He was asking about you." Violet's hands went cold. "What did he say?" "Said he's heard his wife's been working in my establishment. Wanted to know if it was true." "And what did you tell him?" Her voice sounded distant to her own ears. Frank looked uncomfortable. "I told him I employ a woman named Violet Nichols, not Harrington." But he didn't seem convinced. "Did he say he was coming here?" "No, but he was heading over to the sheriff's office when I saw him last." Frank hesitated. "Violet, if there's trouble between you and Harrington, maybe it's best you move on from Dry Creek. You've been a good worker, and I'd hate to see you come to harm." The kindness in his voice nearly undid her. Frank had never asked about her past, had given her work when no one else would. He'd been fair when fairness was in short supply. "Thank you," she managed. "But I have nowhere to go." "Everyone's got somewhere," Frank countered. "Just might take some finding, is all." That night, sleep eluded Violet entirely. Every creak of the old building, every distant hoofbeat had her sitting bolt upright, certain that Thomas had come to claim what he considered his property. By morning, dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her nerves were stretched to breaking point. She was sweeping the saloon floor when the doors swung open, admitting a shaft of bright morning light and the bulky silhouette of Sheriff Dunn. "Miss Nichols," he said, removing his hat. "Got a moment to talk?" Violet's grip tightened on the broom handle. "Of course, Sheriff. Had a visit from Thomas Harrington yesterday," he said, getting straight to the point. "Claims you're his lawful wife, run off some years back." "And what business is that of yours, Sheriff?" Violet asked, striving to keep her voice steady. "None, ordinarily. A domestic dispute isn't my concern." The sheriff scratched his chin. "But Harrington's making some serious accusations. Says you stole family heirlooms when you left. Valuable ones." Violet's laugh held no humor. "The only things I took when I left that house were the clothes I was wearing and the bruises he gave me." Sheriff Dunn had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Be that as it may, he's filed a formal complaint. Says he has proof." "What proof?" "Didn't say specifically. But he's demanding you return to the ranch to sort things out," as he put it. Cold dread pooled in Violet's stomach. "And if I refuse? Then I'd have to consider you in potential violation of the law." The sheriff sighed, looking genuinely regretful. "Look, Miss Nichols or Mrs. Harrington, whatever you prefer, I'm not here to force you back to a bad situation. But Harrington's an influential man in these parts. If he's determined to pursue this." "I understand," Violet said, her mind racing. "When does he expect an answer?" "He's giving you until tomorrow noon. Says after that, he'll be forced to take more direct action." After the sheriff left, Violet stood frozen in place, panic rising in her throat. Thomas had found her, had always known where she was, most likely, and was now using the law to force her return. Once back at the ranch, isolated from town and any potential witnesses, she would be completely at his mercy. She needed to find Caleb. Whatever evidence he'd gathered against Thomas might be her only hope now. But Caleb found her first. As dusk fell, he appeared at the back door of the saloon, his expression taut with urgency. "We need to leave," he said without preamble. "Tonight." "Harrington knows," Violet said. "He's been to the sheriff." "It's worse than that," Caleb replied grimly. He knows about me too. One of his men recognized me from a job I did in Wyoming last year. We've got maybe hours before he puts it all together. But your investigation, I've got enough. Not as much as I'd hoped, but enough to bring charges. I've already sent word to the Cattlemen's Association. They'll have men here within days. Caleb took her hands in his. But we can't wait for them, Violet. It's not safe for either of us now. The decision should have been agonizing, but instead, Violet felt a strange calm descend. I need 10 minutes to gather my things. Make it 5, Caleb advised. I've got horses waiting behind the livery stable. True to her word, Violet was ready in less than 10 minutes, a small bundle containing her meager possessions clutched in her arms. She left a brief note for Frank, thanking him for his kindness and apologizing for her abrupt departure. The night was moonless, a blessing that cloaked their movements as they made their way through the sleeping town. True to his word, Caleb had 2 horses saddled and ready, with provisions enough for several days' journey. We'll head north, he explained as they mounted up. I know a place in Wyoming where we can lie low until the association deals with Harrington. They had barely cleared the town limits when the sound of hoofbeats thundered behind them. Violet's heart hammered against her ribs as she turned to see 3 riders in pursuit, their forms silhouetted against the distant lights of Dry Creek. Harrington's men, Caleb said grimly. They must have been watching the saloon. Ride hard and stay close. What followed was a desperate race through darkness, with only starlight to guide their way. Caleb led them off the main trail and into rougher country, where the risk of a horse stumbling was high, but their chances of losing their pursuers improved. Violet, who had ridden since childhood, matched his pace, ducking low branches and trusting her mount to find sure footing. The sounds of pursuit grew fainter, then louder again as their hunters caught their trail. A shot cracked through the night, wide of its mark but close enough to send a spray of bark from a tree near Violet's head. There's a river ahead, Caleb called over the drumming of hooves. If we can cross it, we might lose them in the canyon beyond. The river loomed before them, a silver ribbon in the darkness. It wasn't especially wide, but the spring melt had swollen it beyond its usual banks, making the crossing treacherous. Stay directly behind me, Caleb instructed, guiding his horse into the rushing water. Violet followed, gasping as the icy current swirled around her legs. Her horse fought against the pull of the water, snorting in distress but pushing forward. They were halfway across when another shot rang out, this one striking the water dangerously close to them. Almost there, Caleb encouraged, his voice barely audible above the rush of water and the continued gunfire. They reached the far bank just as their pursuers reached the river's edge. One attempted to follow them into the water, but was forced back when his horse balked at the current. The others fired a few more futile shots before their figures receded into the darkness. They'll look for another crossing, Caleb said, urging his horse up the steep bank. We need to find shelter before dawn. They rode for another hour, following a narrow game trail that wound deeper into the rugged country. Finally, Caleb led them to a small cabin nestled against a cliff face, nearly invisible among the surrounding pines. Trapper's cabin, he explained as they dismounted. Abandoned for years now, but it'll give us shelter for the night. Inside, the cabin was spare but sound a single room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, and a narrow cot. Caleb quickly built a small fire while Violet tended to the horses, unsaddling them and rubbing them down before securing them in a lean-to attached to the cabin's side. When she returned inside, the fire had taken the worst of the chill from the air. Caleb was laying out their provisions on the table: jerky, hardtack, and a flask of what proved to be surprisingly good whiskey. Not the finest dining, he apologized, but it'll keep us going. Violet sank onto a rough wooden stool, the events of the night finally catching up with her. Her hands trembled as she accepted the flask. I can't believe we made it. We're not clear yet, Caleb cautioned. But we've bought ourselves some time. Time for what? Even if the Cattlemen's Association arrests Thomas for rustling, he's still legally my husband. I'm still his property in the eyes of the law. Not if you can prove cruelty, Caleb said. With the right lawyer in Denver, I can prove nothing, Violet interrupted bitterly. It would be my word against his. And Thomas is very careful about where he leaves his marks. Caleb's expression hardened. There's more than one kind of justice in this world, Violet. What does that mean? It means I've spent the past 2 weeks gathering evidence not just of Harrington's rustling operation, but of his other crimes too, including how he treats those under his power. He reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a packet of papers. Statements from former ranch hands. Records of hospital visits by workers who were accidentally injured. And this. He handed her a small leather-bound book. Opening it, Violet recognized her husband's neat, precise handwriting and felt ill as she read the cold, clinical descriptions of the discipline he'd administered to her during their marriage, complete with dates and justifications for each incident. "Where did you find this?" she whispered. "Hidden compartment in his desk. He keeps records of everything, his business dealings, his crimes, his cruelties. It's all there, in his own hand." Caleb's voice was gentle. "It's enough, Violet. Enough to free you legally, and enough to put him away for a very long time." Tears spilled down Violet's cheeks, not of sorrow, but of a relief so profound it bordered on pain. The thought that someone had believed her, had sought evidence on her behalf when the rest of the world had been content to label her used and unwanted, was almost more than she could bear. Caleb knelt beside her, taking her hands in his. "I promised I'd help you, and I meant it. But somewhere along the way, it became about more than just doing the right thing." His eyes held hers, earnest and unwavering. "I know it's too soon, and that you have every reason to distrust a man's words. But I need you to know that I've never met anyone like you, Violet. Your strength, your dignity despite everything this town has thrown at you. You're not just someone I want to help. You're someone I want to know, for however long you'll allow it." Violet withdrew her hands, not in rejection, but in caution. "You don't know me, Caleb. Not really." "I know enough," he said simply. "I know you survived when many would have broken. I know you built a life for yourself when all the cards were stacked against you. And I know that when I look at you, I see all I could ever want in a partner: courage, resilience, and a heart that, despite everything, still has the capacity for kindness." "Pretty words," Violet murmured, echoing her dismissal from their meeting by the cottonwood. "Then let me prove them with actions," Caleb replied. "Day by day, for as long as it takes." In the flickering firelight, with danger still lurking beyond the cabin walls, such promises should have seemed foolish, even reckless. Yet something in Caleb's steady gaze made Violet wonder if perhaps, against all odds, she had found the rarest of things: a man whose actions truly did match his words. "One day at a time," she agreed softly. "That's all I can offer. It's all I'm asking for." Caleb smiled, the warmth of it reaching his eyes. For now, they spent the night in the cabin, taking turns keeping watch. By morning, there was no sign of pursuit, though neither of them took that as cause for complacency. They ate a sparse breakfast and set out again, this time heading northeast toward the Wyoming Territory, where Caleb had friends who could offer more substantial shelter. The journey took 3 days, during which they avoided main trails and settlements, camping in remote spots and keeping vigilant watch. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, they crested a ridge to see a small ranch nestled in a verdant valley below a cluster of well-maintained buildings surrounded by grazing cattle. "My friend Jacob's place," Caleb explained. "He was a Texas Ranger before he settled here. We can trust him." Jacob Winters and his wife Martha welcomed them with the straightforward hospitality of frontier people. No excessive questions, just food, shelter, and the quiet understanding that those in need deserved assistance first and explanations later. That night, after a proper meal and the luxury of clean clothes and warm baths, Violet found herself sitting on the porch of the Winters' home, watching the stars emerge in the vast Wyoming sky. Caleb joined her, offering a cup of coffee. "Word came while you were resting," he said. "The Cattlemen's Association men arrived in Dry Creek yesterday. Thomas Harrington has been arrested for cattle rustling, fraud, and assault on a law officer who tried to search his property." Violet's hands tightened around the warm cup. "And the evidence? The ledger? Safe with a federal marshal who's a friend of Jacob's. It's over, Violet. Harrington will face justice for his crimes, all of them." The relief was dizzying. "What happens now?" "That depends on you," Caleb said. "Jacob says you're welcome to stay here as long as you need. Martha could use the help with the house and the children. Or," he hesitated, "or you could come with me to Denver. I have another job lined up there, investigating a land fraud case. It would mean starting over in a new city, but it would also mean freedom, real freedom, to build whatever life you choose. And where would you fit in this new life of mine? Violet asked, watching his face carefully. Wherever you want me to, Caleb answered honestly. As a friend, as more than a friend. Or simply as someone who helped you get there, if that's what you prefer. Violet looked out at the darkening valley, considering his words. For 3 years, she had lived in fear and shame, defined by others' judgments and limited by circumstances beyond her control. Now, suddenly, possibilities stretched before her like the vast Wyoming sky, endless, daunting, and filled with potential. I think, she said slowly, that I'd like to go to Denver. Not to hide or to run, but to start again. To be Violet Nichols, not Thomas Harrington's runaway wife. Caleb nodded, respecting her choice. And my place in that new beginning. Violet turned to face him fully, allowing herself to really look at this man who had risked so much to help a woman he barely knew, this man whose gaze held respect rather than judgment, whose words were backed by actions, and whose presence beside her felt increasingly like coming home. I think, she said, a smile forming on lips that had almost forgotten the shape of happiness, that I'd like you to be part of that new beginning. One day at a time, as we agreed, but with the hope that those days might grow into something permanent. Caleb's answering smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. I'd like that very much. He reached for her hand, and this time, Violet didn't pull away. Instead, she laced her fingers through his, feeling the strength and gentleness in his touch, a touch that promised protection without possession, partnership without domination. They called me used and unwanted, she said softly. For so long, I started to believe it myself. Caleb brought her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. They were wrong, he said with quiet conviction. You're all I'll ever want, Violet Nichols. All I'll ever need. And I'll spend however long you'll give me making sure you never doubt your worth again. Under the vast Wyoming sky, with the wounds of the past beginning to heal and the promise of tomorrow stretching before them, Violet allowed herself to believe him, not because she needed a man's validation to know her own worth, but because after years of darkness, she had found someone who saw her light even when she couldn't see it herself. And that, perhaps, was the truest definition of love. Spring came to Denver in a riot of colors, transforming the bustling city with flowering trees and garden plots tucked between growing neighborhoods. 6 months had passed since Violet and Caleb had fled Dry Creek in the dead of night, and life had reshaped itself in ways Violet could never have imagined. Thomas Harrington had been convicted of multiple crimes and sentenced to 15 years in the territorial prison. The divorce papers had been finalized 3 months ago, facilitated by a sympathetic judge who had been moved by the evidence of Thomas's cruelty. Violet Nichols was, at last, legally and truly free. She had found work in a respectable millinery shop owned by a widow who valued Violet's eye for color and design. For the first time, she was building a reputation based on her skills rather than her past, a reputation that had recently earned her a promotion to assistant manager. And then there was Caleb. True to his word, he had given her space and time, never rushing or pressuring her as she found her footing in her new life. They had begun with shared meals and walks through the city, conversations that stretched from dusk until dawn, and a friendship that had gradually, naturally deepened into something more. Now, as she walked arm in arm with him through the city park, Violet felt a contentment she had once believed was forever beyond her reach. I received a letter from Martha Winters yesterday, she told him. She says the apple trees we planted before we left are starting to blossom. I'm glad, Caleb smiled. Jacob wrote that they're expecting their 4th child in the autumn. Life goes on, Violet mused, even after the worst storms. Especially then, Caleb agreed, guiding her to a bench beneath a flowering cherry tree. As they sat, he seemed suddenly nervous, fidgeting with something in his pocket. Violet, he began, then paused, collecting himself. These past months have been the happiest of my life. Watching you rebuild, seeing you grow confident and strong, it's been an honor to witness. You helped make it possible, she reminded him gently. No, he shook his head. I might have provided an opportunity, but the courage was all yours. You're the strongest person I've ever known, Violet Nichols. He withdrew a small box from his pocket, and Violet's breath caught as she realized its significance. I know we agreed to take things one day at a time, Caleb continued, and I'll respect whatever answer you give me. But I find myself wanting all the days, all the years if you're willing to share them. He opened the box to reveal a simple gold band set with a small, perfect sapphire. I'm not asking you to belong to me. I'm asking if I can belong to you, as your husband, your partner, your equal in all things. Tears blurred Violet's vision as she looked from the ring to the face of the man who had seen value in her when she'd forgotten it herself, the man who had called her brave and meant it, who had promised to prove his words with actions and had done so every day since. Yes, she whispered, her voice gaining strength as joy rose within her. Yes, Caleb Quinn, I'll marry you. As he slipped the ring onto her finger and gathered her into his arms, Violet thought of how far she had come from that saloon in Dry Creek, from the woman labeled, used, and unwanted, to someone cherished, respected, and loved for exactly who she was. You're all I'll ever want, Caleb murmured against her hair, echoing the words he'd first spoken under Wyoming stars. All I'll ever need. And this time, as his lips found hers in a kiss that held both tenderness and passion, Violet believed him completely, not as a desperate hope or a distant dream, but as the simple, beautiful truth of a love that had been worth waiting for. In the years that followed, as they built a home and a family together, that truth never wavered. And whenever Violet caught a glimpse of her reflection in shop windows, in still ponds, in the loving gaze of her husband, she no longer saw someone damaged or diminished. She saw a woman who had survived, who had thrived, who had found the courage to claim the happiness that had always been her right. She saw herself whole, wanted, and deeply loved.